Hi guys, today we are going to tell you the entire history of human languages, from grunts to words. Settle in, get comfortable, and allow your mind to drift gently backward in time, long before writing, long before stories, long before words themselves. Before there were names for things, there was listening. Before humans spoke, they heard the world first, wind moving through tall grass, water sliding over smooth stones, the distant call of animals at dusk, the crackle of fire. The slow rhythm of breathing in the dark. For most of human existence, silence was not empty. It was full of signals, patterns, and meaning, and language did not arrive suddenly. It did not appear fully formed. It grew slowly, patiently over countless generations, shaped by survival, emotion, and connection. Tonight, we begin at the very beginning, before words, before grammar, before speech as we know it, when the human voice was still discovering itself. Imagine the earliest humans moving across open land. Their world was vast, unpredictable, and alive. Survival depended not only on strength or speed, but on awareness. Eyes scanned the horizon, ears listened constantly. A sudden sound could mean danger, a familiar sound could mean safety. Communication existed long before language. Bodies spoke first. A raised hand meant stop. A sudden crouch meant danger. A slow approach meant calm. Facial expressions carried meaning without sound. Fear widened the eyes, calm softened the face. Trust revealed itself through stillness. These signals required no teaching. They were instinctive, shared across generations, and understood without explanation. But bodies alone were not enough. As human groups grew larger and life became more complex, sound began to play a greater role, not speech but vocalization. The earliest human sounds were not words, they were raw expressions of emotion and intent, short grunts, sharp calls. Long breaths released through the throat, low hums made without thought. These sounds were shaped by urgency, not structure. A sudden noise to warn, a softer sound to soothe, a repeated call to gather attention. They were closer to animal calls than to language, but they carried something new. They carried feeling. Among these early sounds, one stands out as especially important: humming. Humming requires control. It requires steady breath and a relaxed throat. It is not a sound of alarm, it is a sound of calm. Early humans likely hummed without realizing it, while resting, while walking, while sitting near firelight. The vibration of the voice had a grounding effect. It soothed children, it eased tension, it created a shared atmosphere of safety. Humming had no meaning in the way words do, but it created connection. Rhythm soon followed. Life moved in rhythms, footsteps across land, hands shaping tools, bodies working together. Sound naturally matched these patterns, simple repeated tones, low chants. Breath synchronized between people. In these moments, sound became social. It wasn't about transmitting information, it was about belonging, and that mattered deeply. As time passed, humans began to imitate the sounds of the world around them. The growl of an animal, the splash of water, the rustle of leaves. Imitation was a bridge between sound and meaning. When someone made a sound that resembled an animal, others understood the reference. When a certain call was used repeatedly in the same situation, its meaning became familiar. This was not language yet, but it was association. A sound was no longer just noise, it pointed to something. Over generations, these sounds became more refined, less accidental, more deliberate. Groups developed their own sound patterns based on their environment. Those who lived near forests produced different sounds than those near open plains. Breath, tone, and rhythm adapted naturally. Language was already diverging long before words existed. Children played a crucial role in this process. Young humans listened more than they spoke. They absorbed the sounds around them. They experimented. They repeated tones. They copied rhythms. No one taught them what sounds meant. Meaning was learned through context. A certain sound always came before food, another always came before danger. A softer sound always meant comfort. Over time, these patterns became predictable. And predictability allowed memory. When sound could be remembered, it could be anticipated. When it could be anticipated, it became useful. This was a turning point. As the human body slowly evolved, so did the voice. Breath control improved. The throat lowered slightly. The tongue became more flexible. Lips gained finer movement. These changes allowed humans to produce a wider range of sounds, not just loud or soft, but shaped, differentiated, sustained. Sounds could now be longer, shorter, sharper. Rounded, the voice was becoming an instrument. With this new control, humans began producing what we might call proto-words, simple vocal units tied consistently to specific ideas. These were not complex, they were not abstract. They referred to immediate, shared experiences, food, danger, movement, presence. But something remarkable had happened. Sound had become symbolic. One of the most profound moments in human history was the act of naming. To name something is to separate it from the rest of the world, to give it identity. A particular sound became associated with a specific animal, another with a tool, another with a person. Once something had a name, it could be referred to even when it was not present. This changed everything. Humans could now warn others about danger that was not yet visible, plan movement, recall past events, anticipate future needs. Language extended human awareness beyond the present moment. It allowed memory to be shared. Conversation emerged slowly, not as debate, not as storytelling, but as exchange. One sound offered, another returned, call and response. Pauses mattered as much as sound. Silence was not empty, it was part of communication. Tone mattered deeply. A single sound could mean different things depending on pitch, speed, and context. Early conversation was inseparable from gesture and expression. The whole body spoke together. Meaning lived in the space between people. As generations passed, patterns formed. Certain sounds came first, others followed. Order began to matter. This was the birth of structure, not grammar as we know it, but rhythm and sequence. Sound combinations became predictable, shared, repeated. Language was no longer just reaction, it was narration. People could now describe events, not just what was happening, but what had happened. Stories began here. Simple accounts of movement, of encounters, of survival. Stories preserved knowledge. Knowledge preserved life. Language strengthened bonds within groups. It allowed cooperation to deepen, teaching to occur, emotional expression to expand. Comfort could be given through sound alone, reassurance spoken softly in the dark. Language became a shared space, a quiet bridge between minds, and yet it was still fragile. Words were few, meaning relied heavily on context. Misunderstanding was common, but language continued to grow. Slowly, gently, without urgency. The foundation had been laid, but language was still young. At this stage, human speech remained closely tied to the present moment. Sounds described what was seen, felt, or immediately remembered. They did not yet travel far into imagination or abstraction, but slowly, very slowly, that began to change. As human groups spent more time together, sharing shelter, food, and fire, the need to communicate more than immediate danger or comfort became clear. Survival was no longer just about reacting, it was about coordination. Hunting together required timing, gathering required direction, caring for the young required patience and reassurance. Sound began to stretch its purpose. Around evening fires, humans lingered longer. Firelight created safety. Darkness pushed danger outward beyond the circle of warmth. In these moments, voices softened, sounds lengthened. Silence became intentional rather than accidental. This was where language began to slow down. A sound no longer had to be sharp or urgent. It could unfold gently. It could be repeated for emphasis. It could be shaped to hold attention. Fire encouraged togetherness, and togetherness encouraged communication. People sat facing one another. Faces were visible. Eyes reflected light. Subtle expressions could be seen clearly. Sound and sight worked together. This closeness allowed experimentation. Someone tried a new sound. Others listened. If it was useful, it was remembered. If not, it faded. Language evolved through quiet trial and error. Over time, certain sounds became strongly associated with actions. A sound that always preceded movement. A sound that always followed success. A sound used only when danger had passed. Patterns emerged. These patterns were not rules written down. They lived in memory, reinforced through repetition. Children absorbed them instinctively. Elders reinforced them unconsciously. Language became tradition. With repetition came refinement. Sounds grew clearer, less ambiguous, more consistent. Where once a single grunt might carry multiple meanings depending on context, now different sounds began to separate those meanings. One sound for food, another for water, another for rest. This separation reduced confusion and strengthened cooperation. The human mind was adapting to hold more distinctions, more associations, more remembered sounds. Language and thought were shaping each other. As vocabulary slowly expanded, humans encountered a new challenge: how to combine sounds. At first, sounds existed mostly alone. One idea, one sound, but life was rarely so simple. What if the food was far away? What if danger had already passed? What if someone was missing? To express these ideas, sounds began to be placed together. Not yet sentences, but sequences. A sound for animal, followed by a sound for there. A sound for danger, followed by a sound for gone. Order mattered. The meaning changed depending on which sound came first. This was a quiet revolution. Sequence allowed humans to describe relationships between things, not just objects but actions, not just actions but timing. Language was becoming capable of expressing cause and effect. Something happened, then something else followed. This ability strengthened memory and planning. Humans could now share lessons learned without reenacting them. Experience could be transferred through sound alone. As this happened, conversation grew richer, no longer just call and response, but shared attention. One person spoke, another listened, then responded with understanding rather than repetition. This required patience. Pauses became longer, silence more deliberate. Listening became as important as speaking. Language was no longer just noise in the air, it was a cooperative act. Emotion also deepened within speech. Early sounds had always carried feeling, but now emotion could be directed. Comfort could be offered intentionally, reassurance shaped carefully. A gentle tone could ease fear, a low, steady rhythm could calm distress. Parents used sound to soothe children, groups used sound to restore balance after danger. Language became emotional regulation. As humans spent more time together, they began speaking about people themselves. Names grew more specific, not just a sound for person, but a distinct sound for each individual. Names strengthened identity. To be named was to be recognized, to be remembered. This deepened social bonds and accountability. Language was weaving humans together. With names came reference. People could now talk about others who were not present. This expanded social awareness. Someone could be warned about another's behavior. Someone could be praised. Someone could be missed. Language created a shared social memory. Gradually, humans began to speak not only about what was visible, but about what was remembered. Events from earlier in the day, encounters from the past, movements of animals seen before. This was the beginning of narrative. Stories were still simple, brief, practical, but they carried time within them. Language had learned to travel backward. As memory entered language, imagination followed, not imagination as fantasy, but as possibility. Humans could now discuss what might happen if the animals returned, if the weather changed, if the group moved tomorrow. This was planning. Language allowed thought to step ahead of action. This changed how humans interacted with their environment. As groups grew larger, language adapted again. Not everyone could see everything at once. Information had to be passed quickly and clearly. Certain sounds became louder, more pronounced. Others softened for close conversation. Tone became situational. Humans learned when to raise their voices and when to whisper. Language learned volume. Different environments shaped different sounds. Open plains favored long calls that traveled far. Forests favored sharper sounds that cut through dense space. Cold air carried sound differently than warm air. Language adapted naturally without intention. Each group's speech reflected where they lived. This was the quiet birth of variation. Over long periods, these variations deepened. Sounds shifted slightly from generation to generation. Some sounds disappeared, others emerged. Language was alive. There was no single human language, only many evolving ones, but all shared the same roots: breath, sound, connection. At this point in our journey, language has become stable enough to be passed down reliably, but flexible enough to change. It can describe the present, recall the past, anticipate the future. It binds groups together and separates them from others. It comforts, it warns, it remembers, but it is still grounded in the concrete world. Abstract ideas have not yet fully arrived. That comes later. As time continued its slow, patient movement forward, human language began to step beyond immediate survival and simple coordination. It was no longer only about food, danger, or movement. Something quieter and more profound was taking shape. Humans were beginning to speak about meaning. Around fires that burned low through the night, voices carried further than they ever had before, not in volume, but in intention. Sounds lingered. Phrases stretched, pauses grew longer, as if the speakers themselves were listening to what language might become next. These moments were unhurried. There was no rush. The world beyond the fire was dark and unknown, but within the circle of light, sound created a sense of order. Language began to hold attention. One person would speak and others would listen, not because they had to, but because the sounds carried value. They described events that were already over, hunts that had succeeded, paths that had proven safe, mistakes that had nearly cost lives. These accounts were not dramatic, they were practical, calm, measured, but something new was happening. The listener did not need to have been there to understand. Through sound alone, experience was being transferred. This was the birth of shared memory. As shared memory grew, language began to lengthen. Single sounds became clusters. Clusters became sequences. Sequences became early sentences, not defined by grammar but by rhythm and order. The speaker learned instinctively where to pause. The listener learned when to expect the next sound. Language became predictable enough to follow, yet flexible enough to adapt. This balance allowed stories to emerge. Early stories were not entertainment. They were tools. They explained where water could be found, which animals were dangerous, which seasons brought hardship, but within these stories lived something else as well. Emotion, a hunt retold carried relief, a loss carried sorrow, a narrow escape carried tension. Tone conveyed what facts alone could not. Language now carried feeling across time. As stories grew longer, humans began to refer not only to events but to causes, why something happened, how it unfolded, what could be learned from it. This was a subtle but powerful shift. Language was no longer just recounting reality, it was interpreting it. Humans were beginning to search for patterns. With patterns came explanation. If animals moved a certain way before a storm, that movement was remembered. If certain plants appeared after rain, that appearance was noted. Language connected observation to outcome. This strengthened knowledge. Groups that communicated well survived more consistently. Their language carried wisdom accumulated over generations. Language became inheritance. As inheritance grew, so did the need to preserve it. Memory alone was fragile. Details could fade. Meanings could shift. To protect important knowledge, humans repeated stories carefully. Certain phrases were spoken the same way each time. Certain sequences were not altered. Repetition became ritual. Language stabilized. Ritual speech differed from everyday communication. It was slower, more deliberate, often rhythmic. These repeated sounds were easier to remember and harder to change. Ritual language preserved the group's understanding of the world. It also created unity. When many voices repeated the same sounds, belonging was reinforced. Language became identity. With identity came distinction. Groups recognized that they spoke differently from others. Their sounds felt familiar, others felt strange. This difference was not intentional. It was the natural result of separation and environment, but it mattered. Language marked who belonged and who did not. It shaped trust. As groups encountered one another, language adapted again. Gestures returned to support unfamiliar sounds, tone softened, repetition increased. Humans learned to listen carefully to unfamiliar speech. They noticed patterns, repeated sounds, shared gestures. Even without full understanding, communication was possible. Language proved flexible. Within groups, language continued to expand. New sounds emerged to describe new tools, new practices, new relationships. As social structures grew more complex, language followed. Sounds differentiated age, role, experience. There were sounds reserved for elders, sounds for children, sounds for leadership. Language reflected social structure without explaining it directly. Emotion grew more nuanced within speech, not just fear or comfort, but pride, disappointment, gratitude. Tone became more precise. A slight change in pitch could alter meaning. Humans learned to hear these differences intuitively. Language refined emotional awareness. As emotional language developed, humans began to speak about internal experiences. Hunger had always been communicated, pain had always been expressed, but now humans spoke about anticipation, concern, satisfaction. These were quieter states, harder to observe externally. Language allowed the internal world to be shared. This deepened empathy. With empathy came cooperation at a new level. Humans could now support one another not only physically, but emotionally. A person could be reassured before danger arrived, comforted after loss without explanation. Language created shared inner space. As generations passed, children grew up surrounded by more complex speech. They heard longer stories, more varied sounds. Their minds adapted. They learned faster, combined sounds earlier, created new expressions. Language growth accelerated, not suddenly but steadily. Each generation stood on the foundation of the last. Over time, humans began to use language not only to describe what was, but what should be. Simple guidance emerged. Do not go there, stay close. Wait. These sounds carried authority not through force, but through trust. Language shaped behavior. As guidance expanded, so did teaching. Skills were explained verbally, not only demonstrated. How to shape tools, how to track animals, how to prepare food. Language saved time. It reduced trial and error. It preserved knowledge beyond individual lifespan. At this stage, language had become deeply embedded in daily life. Silence still existed, but it was chosen, not imposed. Sound filled space gently. Humans spoke while working, resting, walking. Language flowed naturally like breath. With this constant use, language diversified further. Certain phrases became shortcuts. Instead of explaining an entire situation, a short sound could imply it. These were early idioms, expressions understood through shared experience. Language gained layers. As layers accumulated, abstractions slowly emerged. Humans began to speak about things that were not directly visible. The coming of seasons, the movement of herds beyond sight. Language reached outward, time itself entered speech. Not just now or not now, but before and after, yesterday, tomorrow. These concepts were not precise, but they existed. Language allowed humans to organize experience along a timeline. This reshaped thought. With time came reflection. Humans considered past choices. They learned from them. Language allowed regret, satisfaction, and hope to coexist. The mind expanded. As speech grew more complex, listening became a skill. Good listeners were valued. They remembered details, repeated stories accurately. They preserved language integrity. Listening became as important as speaking. As this part of our journey draws toward its close, language has become far more than sound. It is memory. It is teaching. It is emotion. It is identity. But it is still spoken only. There are no symbols yet, no writing, no marks to preserve speech beyond the moment. Everything lives in breath and mind. Language had learned how to remember. It had learned how to teach. Now it began to search for meaning beyond the visible world. As humans lived longer within the same landscapes, patterns emerged that could not always be explained through direct cause and effect. Storms arrived without warning. Animals vanished and returned. Life ended suddenly. New life appeared just as mysteriously. Language turned toward these unknowns, not with certainty but with curiosity. When something could not be seen or touched, it was still spoken about. Sounds were shaped to describe forces rather than objects, events rather than actions, presence rather than form. Language reached beyond the immediate. This was not imagination as fantasy, but as interpretation. Humans used speech to give shape to what they could not fully understand. Around shared fires, stories grew longer and more layered. They no longer focused only on what happened, but on what it meant. Why did the hunt fail? Why did the storm come early? Why did someone not return? These questions were not asked directly, but language circled them gently. Stories began to carry explanation, not always accurate, but deeply human. In these stories, patterns were personified. Natural forces were described as if they listened, moved, or responded. This made the world feel less chaotic. Language softened uncertainty by giving it form. If something could be spoken about, it could be held emotionally. As symbolic speech emerged, repetition became essential. Important stories were told again and again, not word for word, but sound for sound, rhythm for rhythm. Certain phrases were preserved carefully. These phrases became anchors of meaning. Language stabilized belief. Belief did not mean certainty. It meant shared understanding. When many people accepted the same explanation, it shaped behavior. Language guided how people prepared, waited, celebrated, or mourned. Speech shaped ritual. Ritual language differed from everyday speech. It was slower, measured, often quieter. It used familiar sounds in deliberate order. Pauses were meaningful. Silence was part of the expression. Ritual speech marked moments as important. Birth, loss, change. Language framed experience. As ritual developed, so did symbolism. Certain sounds came to represent entire ideas. A single word could evoke a story. A short phrase could recall a shared belief. Language became compressed, meaning deepened. Children learned these sounds early, not because they understood them fully, but because they felt their weight. Tone conveyed importance before meaning was clear. Language taught reverence. As groups grew more stable, elders became guardians of speech. They remembered long stories, important phrases, proper sequences. Their voices carried authority not through force but through memory. Language gained continuity. As generations passed, speech became more refined. Sounds that were difficult to pronounce were simplified, others were emphasized. Language adapted to ease of use. Efficiency shaped expression. At the same time, beauty emerged. Certain sounds were pleasing, certain rhythms felt satisfying. Language was not only functional, it was aesthetic. Humans enjoyed speaking, they enjoyed listening. Speech became a source of comfort. As sound patterns repeated, musical qualities emerged naturally. Pitch rose and fell, rhythm stabilized, language and music shared roots, chanting emerged, not for performance but for cohesion. Many voices became one, language unified groups emotionally. With unity came memory across time. Stories were told to preserve identity, where the group came from, what it valued, what it feared. Language preserved origin. As these origin stories grew, they shaped worldview. They explained why the group existed, why the land mattered, why certain actions were honored. Language created purpose. Purpose influenced behavior. People acted in ways consistent with spoken stories. Language guided ethics not through rules but through narrative. What had happened before mattered. As narratives expanded, metaphor emerged. Humans described experiences by comparing them to familiar things. Fear might be spoken of as darkness, comfort as warmth, uncertainty as distance. Language layered meaning through association. This deepened expression. Metaphor allowed humans to describe inner states more clearly. Feelings that could not be seen gained language. This strengthened empathy. Listeners recognized themselves in stories. As empathy deepened, social bonds strengthened. Language reduced isolation. Even in silence, shared understanding existed. Speech had reshaped the human mind. Over long periods, language complexity increased steadily. Sentences grew longer. Ideas nested within ideas. Listeners learned to hold more information. Memory capacity expanded. Language and cognition evolved together. With complexity came variation. Different groups emphasized different aspects of speech. Some valued rhythm, some valued clarity, some valued brevity. Language reflected culture. Separation between groups deepened linguistic differences. Sounds shifted subtly over time. Pronunciations changed. Meanings drifted. Language diversified. Yet all languages remained grounded in the same foundations. Breath, sound, rhythm, connection. No language existed in isolation from the body. As speech grew richer, humans began to play with language. Jokes emerged, wordplay appeared, tone was used creatively. Language became expressive beyond necessity. Humor strengthened bonds, shared laughter reinforced belonging. Language carried joy. As this joy spread, storytelling expanded further. Stories were no longer only instructional. They were entertaining, they held attention, they passed time. Language enriched life. As nights grew longer and days quieter, speech filled space gently. Words became companions. Language softened solitude. At this stage, human language had achieved remarkable depth. It could describe the past, anticipate the future, express emotion, preserve belief, create identity, but it was still fleeting. Every word vanished as soon as it was spoken. Memory carried it, but memory could fade. Something new was approaching. Not yet writing, but the idea that speech could be fixed, held, preserved beyond breath. Human speech had grown rich, layered, and deeply meaningful, yet it remained bound to the moment. Every word lived only as long as breath allowed. When the voice fell silent, language relied on memory alone to survive. And memory, though powerful, was fragile. As human groups grew larger and more settled, the need to preserve speech became more urgent. Knowledge was accumulating faster than it could be safely carried by individuals alone. Stories grew longer, beliefs grew more complex, instructions became more detailed, language needed help. The earliest attempts to preserve meaning did not involve words as we know them. They involved reminders, marks in the earth, arrangements of stones, notches carved into wood or bone. These were not writing. They did not represent sounds directly. They represented memory. A mark could recall an event. A pattern could signal a count. An object placed deliberately could trigger a story. These aids extended the reach of language beyond the voice. Humans began to associate certain visual forms with shared meanings. A repeated mark might represent time passing. A grouping of objects might represent quantity. A shape might recall a specific story. These symbols did not speak on their own. They required language to interpret them. But once seen, they called speech back into existence. Language was learning to anchor itself. As these memory aids spread, speech adapted around them. Stories became more structured. Events were told in clearer sequence. Why? Because they were now being recalled again and again using the same physical prompt. Consistency increased. Language became more stable. As stability increased, precision followed. People spoke more carefully when repeating important stories. Details mattered. The exact order of events mattered. Language sharpened itself. This period marked the slow emergence of symbolic thinking tied closely to speech. Humans no longer relied only on sound to represent meaning. They now used the world itself as a reference. Objects held stories, places carried memory, marks signaled significance. Language intertwined with environment. Children grew up learning not only sounds but symbols. They learned which marks mattered, which objects were meaningful, which places held stories. Language expanded beyond the mouth and ears. It lived in space. As symbolic memory grew, so did the length and complexity of stories. People could now recount events spanning seasons rather than moments. They could track migrations, cycles, and changes across time. Language learned continuity. With continuity came tradition. Certain stories were always told in the same place. Certain phrases were always spoken at the same moment. Language became ritualized further. Ritual stabilized meaning across generations. As ritual speech grew more formal, everyday speech grew more flexible. People experimented with new expressions, metaphors, and rhythms. Language developed layers, formal and informal, sacred and casual. This layering allowed speech to adapt to different social situations. As communities became more interconnected, language adapted to negotiation. Trade required clarity. Cooperation required trust. Conflict required restraint. Speech softened edges. Tone became deliberate. Language learned diplomacy. In these interactions, miscommunication revealed itself clearly. When sounds were misunderstood, consequences followed. This encouraged refinement. Pronunciation became more precise, meanings became clearer, language evolved toward efficiency. As efficiency increased, abstraction deepened. Humans spoke more frequently about concepts rather than objects, belonging, obligation, honor, responsibility. These ideas could not be touched or seen, but they shaped behavior. Language made them real. As abstract speech spread, humans began to think differently. They categorized experiences. They grouped ideas. They compared situations. Language reorganized thought. The mind learned to move through concepts rather than just environments. This transformation affected identity. People described themselves not only by physical traits or roles, but by qualities: brave, careful, skilled. Language allowed self-reflection. Humans began to see themselves through words. With self-reflection came evaluation. People considered their actions. They discussed choices. Language enabled moral thought, not rules, but shared values shaped through stories. As values spread, they became embedded in speech. Certain phrases praised desired behavior, others discouraged harmful actions. Language guided conduct subtly, persistently. As generations passed, language diversity continued to expand. Groups separated by distance developed distinct sounds, rhythms, and structures. Some languages favored flowing speech, others favored sharp distinctions. Language mirrored environment and lifestyle. Yet despite diversity, mutual influence occurred where groups met. Sounds were borrowed, expressions exchanged. Language absorbed change naturally. As speech grew richer, silence gained new meaning. Silence could express respect or disagreement or contemplation. Language was no longer only sound, it was the space around sound. As storytelling matured, narrative structure became more recognizable. Beginnings set context, middle sections carried tension, endings resolved meaning. Listeners learned to anticipate these patterns. Language trained attention. This anticipation allowed longer storytelling sessions. Listeners could remain engaged, memory strengthened. Language held larger narratives without confusion. As stories grew longer, specialized storytellers emerged. They remembered vast amounts of speech. They preserved myths, histories, and genealogies. Their role was valued. Language became profession. These storytellers refined language further. They used repetition for emphasis, variation for interest, rhythm for memory. Speech became artful. As art emerged, language crossed another boundary. It began to exist not only to communicate but to evoke. Words created atmosphere. They shaped emotion intentionally. Language gained aesthetic purpose. At this stage, human language had achieved remarkable sophistication. It could preserve memory, shape belief, organize society, express identity, create beauty, yet it still relied entirely on living voices. When speakers died, language risked loss. This vulnerability lingered. Humans sensed this fragility intuitively. They repeated stories carefully. They trained successors. They honored memory. Language clung to life through community. But the idea that meaning could be fixed permanently was growing stronger. Marks were becoming more deliberate, symbols more standardized. The boundary between speech and sign was thinning. Human speech had reached a remarkable level of depth and sophistication, yet it still depended entirely on living voices. Every word, every story, every belief existed only as long as someone remembered to speak it. The breath carried meaning forward, but when the breath ended, meaning risked fading with it. This fragility was felt long before it was fully understood. As communities grew larger and more stable, the amount of shared knowledge expanded. Lineages were remembered, seasonal movements tracked, rituals preserved, stories lengthened. The spoken word carried more than ever before, and slowly humans began to sense that memory alone was no longer enough. At first, the attempt to preserve language did not aim to capture sound itself. Instead, it sought to anchor meaning. People began marking important places, a stone placed deliberately, a pattern scratched into earth, a line carved into wood or bone. These marks were not language, but they were invitations to language. When seen, they reminded people to speak. When remembered, they called stories back into voice. A mark could say, "There is something to remember here." Over time, these marks became more intentional. A certain number of notches might represent a count. A repeated shape might recall a recurring event. A specific arrangement might signal a shared understanding. These symbols were consistent within a group. Their meaning was taught through speech. Language and symbol grew together. As symbols became familiar, they began to shape how stories were told. When a story was linked to a mark, it was told the same way each time. This encouraged consistency. Language became more fixed in form. With fixed form came reliability. A story told today sounded like the story told yesterday. This stability allowed more complex narratives to survive intact. Language became less fluid but more precise. As humans relied more on symbolic memory, they began to notice something remarkable. A mark could represent an idea even when no one was speaking. Meaning could exist silently. This realization changed how humans thought about communication. Language no longer needed a voice at every moment. Gradually, symbols became more abstract. They no longer represented objects directly, but ideas connected to speech. A mark might recall a sound, a shape might cue a word. This was a subtle shift, but a profound one. Symbols were beginning to represent language itself. This did not happen quickly. For a long time, symbols and speech existed side by side. Symbols supported memory. Speech carried meaning. Together, they strengthened one another. As this relationship deepened, humans became more deliberate in how they spoke. When language was tied to symbols, clarity mattered. Sounds needed to be distinct. Words needed to be consistent. Speech refined itself further. Children growing up in this world learned both systems together. They learned stories through voice. They learned reminders through marks. Language became both heard and seen. As symbols grew more standardized within groups, they began to carry authority. A mark placed by elders mattered. It signaled importance. Language associated with that mark gained weight. Speech and symbol reinforced hierarchy. This period saw the rise of deliberate teaching of language, not just sounds, but meanings, sequences, and associations. Language was no longer entirely instinctive. It was guided. As guidance increased, language became more structured. Certain sequences were preferred, certain patterns repeated. Language lined toward order. With order came predictability. Listeners could anticipate what came next. This allowed longer, more complex expressions. Language expanded again. As language expanded, thought followed. Humans could now hold multiple ideas at once. They could compare them. They could weigh them. Language became a tool for reasoning. This reasoning influenced decision-making. Choices were discussed, consequences considered. Language enabled collective planning. As planning grew, so did cooperation. Groups coordinated movement, resources, and effort through speech. Language made large-scale organization possible. As organization increased, identity became more complex. People belonged not only to families, but to communities defined by shared speech. Language became a marker of belonging. Differences in speech signaled difference in group. Pronunciation, rhythm, and vocabulary set communities apart. Language shaped boundaries, yet boundaries were not fixed. When groups met, languages interacted, sounds were exchanged, meanings borrowed. Language evolved through contact. This interaction enriched speech. New expressions entered use. New metaphors emerged. Language adapted dynamically. As adaptation continued, some sounds became obsolete, others emerged. Language shed what it no longer needed. Efficiency guided change. As efficiency increased, humans began to compress meaning. Short expressions carried deep significance. A single phrase could evoke an entire story. Language became dense. This density allowed faster communication. Less sound carried more meaning. Language matured. As speech matured, humans became aware of its power. Words could calm conflict or provoke it. They could unite or divide. Language gained influence. With influence came responsibility. Certain people spoke more carefully. Their words mattered more. Language shaped leadership. As leadership emerged, formal speech developed. Certain phrases were reserved for important moments. Ceremonial language grew. This speech was slow, deliberate, and precise. Ceremonial speech preserved shared values. It reinforced identity. It connected past, present, and future. Language became timeless. As timeless speech evolved, everyday language continued to change. Slang-like expressions emerged. Casual speech flowed freely. Language lived on many levels. These levels allowed flexibility. People spoke differently in different contexts. Language adapted to mood, setting, and purpose. As awareness of language grew, humans began to reflect on speech itself. They noticed differences. They commented on them. Language became self-aware. This self-awareness encouraged refinement. People corrected one another. They standardized pronunciation. Language moved toward consistency. As consistency spread, symbols representing sound became more deliberate. Certain marks consistently evoked certain words. This was not yet writing, but it was close. The idea that sound could be captured visually was forming. This idea spread slowly. It required shared agreement. It required teaching. Required patience, but once established, it changed everything. Language was no longer confined to the moment. It could endure beyond the speaker. At this point in our journey, human language stands on the brink of permanence. Speech has shaped thought, culture, belief, and identity. Symbols have begun to anchor sound. The world is ready for writing even if it does not yet know it. For countless generations, humans had trusted memory and voice to carry meaning forward. Stories lived in breath. Knowledge lived in repetition. Belief lived in sound. But now, slowly and almost unknowingly, humans began to separate language from the body itself. The idea was simple yet profound. If meaning could be reminded by a marker, perhaps sound itself could be held by one. At first, there was no intention to capture speech exactly. Humans were not trying to record conversations or preserve every word. Instead, they wanted to ensure that important meanings did not disappear. Certain stories mattered more than others. Certain agreements needed to last. Certain counts had to remain accurate. Marks grew more deliberate. A line no longer just reminded, it stood for something. Early symbols became consistent. A specific mark always pointed to the same idea. A particular shape always recalled the same story. This consistency mattered. When many people agreed on what a symbol meant, language gained stability beyond sound. As this happened, humans began to notice something remarkable. When they saw a mark, a sound appeared in their mind, not spoken aloud but remembered. This was a quiet mental shift. Symbols were no longer only reminders of meaning, they were reminders of speech. Language was entering the mind visually. This shift encouraged further experimentation. If one mark could recall a word, what if multiple marks could recall a sequence? Symbols were placed together. Their order mattered. Meaning changed depending on arrangement. This mirrored spoken language. These early symbol sequences were not sentences as we know them. They were cues, prompts for speech. A reader did not silently read, they spoke aloud. Symbols guided the voice. Language still lived in sound, but symbols were guiding it. As these systems spread, they required teaching. People learned which symbols matched which sounds. They practiced. Mistakes were corrected. This was the beginning of literacy, though not yet reading in silence. Language learning became more formal. As teaching increased, speech itself adapted. Sounds became more regular. Pronunciations stabilized. Language became clearer because clarity made symbol-to-sound association easier. Writing shaped speech. At the same time, speech shaped symbols. Marks changed to better reflect sounds. Some symbols were simplified, others were altered to avoid confusion. Symbol systems evolved alongside language. Not all sounds were represented. Early systems focused on important words, names, numbers, events. Everyday speech still flowed freely without record. Writing was rare, special, reserved for meaning that needed to last. This rarity gave written language power. A marked surface carried authority. Words placed in symbol form felt permanent. They were treated with care. Language gained weight. As written symbols gained importance, they influenced social roles. Certain people specialized in remembering symbols. They learned how to interpret them accurately. They taught others. Language knowledge became specialized. This specialization strengthened consistency. Stories written down or symbolized changed less over time. Language slowed its evolution in these contexts. Stability increased. As stability increased, humans could build upon past knowledge more easily. They did not need to remember everything themselves. They could refer back. Language extended memory beyond the mind. This extension changed how humans thought. Ideas no longer had to be held entirely in memory. The mind was freed to explore. Language enabled deeper reflection. As reflection deepened, humans began organizing ideas more deliberately. Lists appeared, sequences mattered, order carried meaning, language gained structure. This structure influenced thought patterns. People categorized experiences. They grouped related ideas. Language became analytical. As analysis grew, abstraction expanded. Humans could now think about ideas independently of immediate experience. Concepts like ownership, agreement, obligation gained clarity. Language refined social organization. Written symbols also changed time. A message could be read long after it was created. Language now traveled across generations without distortion. The past could speak directly to the present. This continuity strengthened identity. Groups remembered their origins more clearly. Lineages were tracked, histories preserved. Language connected ancestors to descendants. As histories accumulated, they shaped worldview. People understood themselves as part of a longer story. Language gave life narrative. As narrative deepened, humans reflected on change. They noticed how things differed from before. Language enabled comparison across time. This sharpened awareness. With awareness came planning at a new scale. Long-term decisions became possible. Language supported foresight. As foresight grew, cooperation expanded. Larger groups coordinated through shared language systems. Language scaled society. As societies grew, language diversified internally. Formal language for record keeping, informal language for daily life, specialized language for ritual, trade, teaching. Language layered itself. These layers interacted. Ideas moved from ritual into daily speech. Daily expressions entered formal language. Language remained dynamic. As writing became more common, silent reading slowly emerged. First, reading always involved sound. Later, humans learned to hear words internally. Language moved inward. The mind became a space for speech. This internalization changed cognition. Thought itself took on linguistic structure. People reasoned in words. Language became thought's framework. As inner speech developed, self-reflection deepened. Humans considered their own thoughts. They examined beliefs. Language enabled introspection. This introspection influenced behavior. People questioned actions. They evaluated choices. Language strengthened self-awareness. As self-awareness grew, communication grew more nuanced. Subtle distinctions mattered. Precision increased. Language refined expression. Written language continued to evolve. Symbols became more abstract and efficient. Systems expanded to represent sounds more fully. The gap between speech and symbol narrowed. As this gap narrowed, writing captured more of language's richness. Tone and emotion remained difficult, but meaning endured. Language became increasingly permanent. At this stage, language existed in three forms: spoken aloud, remembered silently, marked physically. Each reinforced the others. Language had become multidimensional, yet this transformation was not uniform. Some groups relied more on speech, others embraced symbols deeply. Language diversity persisted, but the direction was clear. Language was no longer fleeting. It could endure, it could travel, it could outlive its speakers. This permanence reshaped humanity. Knowledge accumulated faster. Culture layered upon culture. Language became civilization's foundation. As this part draws to a close, language has crossed a threshold. It has left the air. It has entered memory, symbol, and mind. It is no longer bound by breath alone. For the first time in human history, words could outlive the moment of their speaking. A thought could be formed, marked, and returned to later. Knowledge no longer depended entirely on constant repetition. It could wait patiently, preserved in symbol and surface. This changed how humans related to time. The past was no longer distant and fragile. It could be revisited. The future was no longer vague. It could be prepared for. Language had learned to remain. As written symbols became more reliable, people began trusting them with increasingly important ideas. Agreements were marked, counts were recorded, lineages were traced. Speech still explained these marks, but the marks now held authority of their own. A spoken promise could be forgotten. A marked promise could be returned to. Language gained weight through permanence. This permanence altered social relationships. When words could be preserved, responsibility changed. Actions could be remembered. Decisions could be revisited. Language began to hold people accountable. Speech gained consequence beyond the moment. As consequence grew, so did care and expression. Words were chosen more deliberately when they were to be marked. Clarity mattered, order mattered, precision mattered. Language refined itself under the pressure of being preserved. With refinement came standardization. Within communities, people began agreeing on preferred symbols and sounds. Variations still existed, but certain forms were recognized as correct for important uses. Language slowly separated into everyday speech and formal expression. This separation allowed flexibility and stability to coexist. Formal language changed slowly. Everyday language changed quickly. Both were necessary. As formal language stabilized, it allowed knowledge to accumulate without distortion. Lists grew longer, records expanded, stories connected across generations. Language began to form chains of understanding, one idea built upon another. As these chains lengthened, humans could engage in deeper reasoning. They compared records. They noticed patterns across years. They recognized change and continuity. Language enabled analysis at a scale never before possible. This analysis affected how humans understood their environment. Seasonal cycles became clearer, animal movements more predictable, resource management more deliberate. Language supported planning not just for tomorrow, but for years ahead. As planning expanded, communities grew more coordinated. Large groups could act together because shared language allowed shared intention. Speech and writing synchronized effort. Language scaled cooperation. With larger cooperation came complexity. Different roles emerged. Some people focused on remembering language, others on teaching it, others on applying it. Language shaped social structure. As roles diversified, language adapted to specialization. New terms emerged to describe tools, actions, and responsibilities. Language expanded its vocabulary to match complexity. As vocabulary expanded, learning language took longer. Children spent more time listening, practicing, and remembering. Language became a long apprenticeship. This strengthened cultural continuity. As children learned both spoken and marked language, their minds adapted. They learned to think in sequences, to anticipate structure, to hold multiple ideas simultaneously. Language trained cognition. This training changed imagination. Humans could now imagine scenarios in detail. They could simulate outcomes before acting. Language became a tool for mental exploration. As mental exploration grew, creativity expanded. People combined ideas in new ways. Language allowed innovation. Innovation fed back into language. New practices required new expressions. Language remained alive, responsive to change. As language spread across regions, differences deepened. Writing systems varied. Speech patterns diverged. Meanings shifted subtly. languages multiplied, yet contact between groups allowed exchange, symbols were borrowed, words adapted, sounds blended, language evolved through interaction. As languages diverged, translation became necessary. People learned to map meanings between systems. This required careful listening and interpretation. Language encouraged empathy. Through translation, humans recognized shared concepts beneath different sounds. Different words could point to the same idea. Language revealed unity beneath diversity. As this awareness grew, humans reflected on language itself. They noticed its patterns, they commented on its use. They began teaching language consciously. Language became an object of thought. This reflection encouraged refinement. People adjusted pronunciation. They clarified meanings. They debated usage. Language became self-correcting. As writing systems matured, they captured more aspects of speech. More sounds were represented. Sequences became clearer. The gap between spoken and written language narrowed. As the gap narrowed, writing became more expressive. Longer narratives were recorded. Ideas once too complex for memory alone were preserved. Language deepened again. With deepened language came expanded culture. Histories were compiled, beliefs articulated, values expressed explicitly. Language became cultural memory. As cultural memory grew, identity strengthened. People understood themselves as part of a story. Language connected individual life to collective past. This connection influenced behavior. Actions were measured against tradition. Language guided conduct through memory. As societies expanded, governance emerged. Rules were spoken, then marked. Agreements recorded. Language structured authority. Authority depended on shared understanding. Language provided that understanding. Clear expression became essential. As clarity became vital, ambiguity was reduced. Terms were defined. Meanings narrowed. Language sharpened. This sharpening allowed fairness. When words were precise, expectations were clearer. Language supported order. As order grew, stability followed. Stable language supported stable society. Yet flexibility remained in everyday speech. Language balanced change and continuity. As literacy spread, silent reading became more common. People could engage with language alone. Thought became more internal. Language shaped inner life. Inner language influenced emotion. People named feelings. They reflected on them. Language supported emotional awareness. As emotional awareness grew, communication deepened. Subtle expression mattered. Tone, pacing, and choice of words gained importance. Language refined connection. As writing endured across generations, humans encountered voices from the past. Ancestors spoke through marks. Language collapsed time. This collapse inspired reverence. Words from the past were treated carefully. Language gained authority through age. As authority accumulated, language influenced belief. People trusted preserved words. Language shaped worldview. Yet language also invited questioning. Records allowed comparison. Differences could be noticed. Language supported critical thought. Critical thought fueled growth. Ideas evolved. Beliefs adapted. Language remained dynamic. At this stage, language had become inseparable from human existence. It shaped thought, memory, emotion, society, identity. Language was no longer a tool, it was a world. Yet despite its power, language remained rooted in its origins. Breath, sound, connection, even written words traced back to spoken ones. As we pause here, language stands fully transformed, from instinctive sounds to structured speech, from fleeting breath to enduring mark, from immediate survival to deep reflection. Language has become the vessel of humanity. Language no longer lived only in moments of speaking or listening. It surrounded daily life. It shaped how knowledge was gathered, how skills were passed on, and how communities understood themselves across generations. The spoken word and the marked symbol now worked together, quietly transforming the way humans learned. Before this turning point, learning was intimate and immediate. A child watched an elder. Hands guided hands. Voices explained what the eyes already saw. Knowledge was absorbed through closeness and repetition. But now, language allowed learning to extend beyond direct experience. With marks preserving meaning, people could learn from events they had not witnessed. A story recorded could teach a lesson long after the original moment had passed. A set of symbols could explain a process even when the teacher was absent. Learning became less dependent on presence. Language opened distance. This distance changed education. Instead of knowledge being passed only from parent to child, it could move from one generation to the next more deliberately. Elders no longer needed to remember everything perfectly. Symbols could assist memory. Speech could follow structure. Teaching became intentional. Instructional language emerged. Speech was used to guide step by step, not just to demonstrate, but to explain sequence, purpose, and outcome. First this, then that. Do not forget this part. Language organized action. As instruction improved, skills became more refined. Tools were made with greater consistency. Techniques were preserved accurately. Innovation no longer erased tradition. Language protected knowledge from loss. As knowledge accumulated, it began to separate into areas. Some language was used for making, some for healing, some for tracking time, some for recounting events. Specialized ways of speaking emerged. Language adapted to knowledge. These specialized forms were not separate languages, but variations in vocabulary and structure. Certain words were used only in certain contexts. Certain expressions carried precise meaning. Language became layered. As layers formed, teaching required explanation. Children learned not only words but when to use them. Context mattered. Language taught social awareness. As education grew more structured, memory techniques improved. Repetition was used deliberately. Rhythm helped retention. Stories were shaped to be memorable. Language learned how to teach itself. As memory improved, humans could hold more information. They could compare ideas. They could notice contradictions. They could refine understanding. Language supported reasoning. Reasoning led to classification. Things were grouped by similarity, events by pattern, actions by outcome. Language categorized the world. These categories shaped perception. Once something had a name, it stood apart. Language highlighted distinctions. As distinctions multiplied, humans developed more precise understanding of their environment. Plants were differentiated. Animals identified by behavior. Seasons described with greater nuance. Language sharpened observation. As observation sharpened, prediction improved. Humans spoke about likelihood rather than certainty. If this happens, then that might follow. Language allowed conditional thought. Conditional thought expanded planning. People prepared for possibilities, not just certainties. Language supported foresight. As foresight grew, societies became more resilient. They stored resources. They planned movements. They adjusted behavior. Language increased survival. As survival stabilized, humans turned more attention inward. They reflected on experience. They discussed feelings, motives, and intentions. Language deepened introspection. With introspection came dialogue. People spoke not only to instruct, but to explore ideas together. Conversation became collaborative. Questions emerged, not demands for action, but expressions of curiosity. Why did this happen? What does it mean? Language invited inquiry. Inquiry expanded understanding. Ideas were tested through discussion. Agreement was reached through shared reasoning. Language became a tool for collective thought. As collective thought developed, consensus gained importance. Shared understanding allowed coordination. Language created agreement. Agreement influenced social harmony. Conflicts were discussed rather than immediately acted upon. Language mediated tension. As mediation improved, societies grew more complex. Different viewpoints coexisted. Language allowed negotiation. Negotiation required subtlety. Tone mattered, word choice mattered, timing mattered. Language refined diplomacy. As diplomacy evolved, trust grew. Trust allowed larger communities. Language scaled society again. As communities expanded, leadership structures formed. Leaders used language to guide, persuade, and unify. Speech became influential. Influential language required responsibility. Words could inspire or harm. Leaders learned to speak carefully. Language shaped power. As power concentrated, formal instruction developed further. Laws were spoken, then marked. Rules were clarified. Language structured order. Order relied on shared interpretation. Language had to be understood similarly by many. This encouraged standard forms. Standardization reduced confusion. Common expressions replaced local variation in important contexts. Language balanced diversity and unity. As unity increased, collective identity strengthened. People described themselves as part of something larger. Language created belonging. Belonging influenced loyalty. Loyalty stabilized groups. Language reinforced cohesion. As cohesion grew, culture deepened. Shared stories, values, and practices were preserved through language. Language became cultural memory. Cultural memory extended across generations. People knew not only how to live, but why. Language preserved meaning. As meaning accumulated, humans reflected on purpose. Why certain actions mattered, why traditions endured. Language supported reflection. Reflection encouraged continuity. Practices were maintained deliberately. Language stabilized culture, yet language also allowed change. New ideas were introduced through speech. Old ideas were questioned. Language supported adaptation. As adaptation continued, learning systems expanded. People sought knowledge actively. They listened, recorded, and taught. Language encouraged curiosity. Curiosity fueled exploration. Exploration introduced new experiences. Language adapted to describe them. As language adapted, it grew richer. New metaphors emerged. New expressions captured unfamiliar ideas. Language expanded its reach. As expression expanded, storytelling evolved again. Stories became more complex. They explored motivations, conflicts, and resolutions. Language deepened narrative. Narrative strengthened empathy. Listeners understood others' perspectives. Language connected minds. As empathy grew, cooperation strengthened. Groups acted with greater understanding. Language improved social bonds. As bonds strengthened, collective memory became more detailed. Histories were preserved with care. Language recorded identity. As identity solidified, education became more intentional. Knowledge was curated. Important ideas were emphasized. Language guided learning. As guidance increased, institutions formed. Places dedicated to learning emerged. Language shaped education. As education spread, literacy grew. More people learned to interpret symbols. Language moved inward again. Silent engagement with language increased. Thought became more structured. Language shaped reasoning. As reasoning matured, humans reflected on knowledge itself. They evaluated sources. They compared ideas. Language supported critical thinking. Critical thinking refined understanding. False assumptions were challenged. Knowledge evolved. Language facilitated growth. As growth continued, humans recognized language as central to existence. It was no longer separate from life. Language was life's framework. Yet beneath all this complexity, language still relied on simple origins. Breath, sound, connection, every word traced back to those first hums and calls. As we pause at the end of this part, language has become a vast system of learning, memory, and shared understanding. It teaches, it preserves, it questions, it connects. At this stage in humanity's long journey, language had become more than a means of survival or communication. It had become a container for wisdom. Knowledge was no longer scattered across individual memories alone. It lived in shared speech, preserved symbols, and carefully repeated instruction. This was the beginning of knowledge traditions. Knowledge traditions did not appear suddenly. They formed gradually as certain ideas proved useful across time. When a way of doing something worked, when it brought safety, success, or balance, it was remembered, repeated, and refined through language. Speech carried these lessons first, then symbols helped hold them. Language became the thread connecting experience across generations. Elders spoke not only of what they had seen, but of what had been told to them. Stories carried layers of memory. A single explanation might contain the experience of many lifetimes. Language compressed time. The past lived inside the present. As this compression deepened, humans became aware of something subtle. Not all knowledge was equal. Some ideas were practical and immediate, others were reflective and guiding. Language began to separate wisdom from instruction. Instruction told people how to do something. Wisdom explained why. Wisdom took longer to express. It relied on story, metaphor, and repetition. It was not rushed. Language slowed itself when carrying wisdom. Wisdom traditions were often spoken in calm tones, repeated at important moments. They were shared during rest, not urgency, around fires, during quiet walks, in moments of reflection. Language adjusted its pace. These traditions shaped behavior subtly. They did not command, they suggested, they reminded. Language guided without force. As wisdom accumulated, it shaped worldview. People understood their place in the world through spoken meaning. They knew what was valued, what was avoided. What was honored. Language transmitted values. As values spread, they stabilized culture. Culture became more than habit, it became intentional. Language reinforced it daily. As intentional culture grew, memory deepened. Stories were no longer told only for entertainment or instruction. They were told to preserve identity, where the group came from, what it believed, why it lived as it did. Language preserved origin. These origin stories were treated carefully. Their wording mattered. Their sequence mattered. Changes were noticed. Language protected meaning. As protection increased, storytellers took on special importance. They remembered long narratives accurately. They maintained rhythm and structure. Language entrusted them with continuity. These storytellers refined language further. They used repetition to anchor memory. They used variation to hold attention. They balanced familiarity and novelty. Language became refined art. As art developed, language gained emotional depth. Stories moved listeners. They evoked sadness, pride, calm, or reflection. Language reached inward. This inward reach strengthened empathy. Listeners felt connected to others' experiences. Language built shared emotional landscapes. As shared emotion deepened, community bonds strengthened, trust grew. Language reinforced belonging. As belonging solidified, groups grew more cohesive. Cohesion allowed stability. Stability allowed complexity. Language supported growth. As complexity increased, knowledge became more layered. Some knowledge was taught early, some later. Language supported progression. Teaching became structured. Lessons followed sequences. Concepts built upon one another. Language organized learning. As learning systems matured, humans became more aware of error. Mistakes were discussed. Lessons adjusted. Language supported correction. Correction improved understanding. Understanding improved outcomes. Language refined practice. As practice refined, humans recognized patterns across knowledge domains. Connections were made, ideas overlapped, language enabled synthesis. Synthesis deepened insight. People saw relationships between different aspects of life. Language unified experience. As unified understanding grew, reflection deepened. Humans spoke about meaning itself, not just how things worked, but what they meant. Language explored purpose. Purpose influenced behavior. Actions aligned with values. Language guided intention. As intention shaped action, tradition stabilized further. Certain practices endured. Language ensured continuity, yet language also allowed renewal. New ideas entered discussion. Old ideas were re-examined. Language balanced preservation and change. As this balance held, societies matured. They adapted without losing identity. Language was the stabilizing force. As societies matured, they developed long-term memory. Histories were remembered carefully. Events placed in sequence. Language structured time. Structured time allowed perspective. Humans understood themselves as part of a longer journey. Language expanded awareness. As awareness expanded, humility emerged. People recognized they were part of something larger. Language conveyed perspective. Perspective shaped decision-making. Short-term actions were weighed against long-term impact. Language supported foresight. As foresight improved, planning deepened. Communities prepared for change. Language enabled resilience. As resilience grew, humans became more reflective. They spoke about uncertainty. They acknowledged limits. Language embraced nuance. Nuance enriched expression. Speech became less absolute. Language captured complexity. As complexity became normal, listening gained importance. Understanding others required patience. Language encouraged attentiveness. Attentiveness strengthened communication. Misunderstanding decreased. Language refined connection. As connection deepened, cooperation flourished. Collective action became smoother. Language coordinated effort. As coordination expanded, knowledge systems grew larger. More ideas could be held collectively. Language scaled memory. As memory scaled, identity strengthened. Groups knew who they were across generations. Language preserved continuity. As continuity deepened, humans reflected on change itself. They noticed how language evolved. They commented on speech patterns. Language became self-observed. This observation encouraged refinement. Expressions were adjusted, meanings clarified, language improved itself. As language improved, knowledge transmission became more reliable. Ideas survived intact, wisdom endured, language became inheritance. As inheritance spread, humans felt responsibility toward future generations. They spoke with care, they taught deliberately. Language carried intention forward. As intention accumulated, humanity became increasingly conscious of its own learning. Knowledge was no longer accidental, it was cultivated. Language made that possible. At this point in our journey, language stands as the keeper of wisdom. It holds memory, meaning, and identity. It guides learning, shapes culture, and connects generations. Yet language continues to evolve. New expressions emerge, old ones fade, the story never stops. Language was no longer only a tool for teaching or remembering. It had become the framework through which entire communities understood reality. Shared speech created shared understanding, and shared understanding shaped collective life. At this stage, humans were not simply individuals speaking the same language. They were participants in a shared mental world. Language had created that world. When people spoke, they were not only exchanging information. They were reinforcing a common way of seeing, interpreting, and responding to existence. Words carried assumptions, phrases carried expectations, stories carried lessons about how the world worked and how one should move within it. Language shaped perception. Two people who shared language could understand one another deeply, even without many words. A single phrase could evoke history, emotion, and meaning all at once. Language compressed complexity into familiarity. This allowed large groups to function with surprising cohesion. As communities expanded, language became the invisible structure holding them together. People who had never met could cooperate because they shared expressions, values, and assumptions carried through speech. Language made strangers feel familiar. With this familiarity came trust. Trust allowed coordination. Coordination allowed societies to grow. Language scaled human cooperation far beyond what instinct alone could manage. As societies grew, so did the need for shared understanding across many people at once. Important ideas had to be communicated clearly and consistently. Language rose to meet this challenge. Public speech emerged. Public speech was slower, more deliberate, and more structured than everyday conversation. It used familiar phrases and repeated ideas to ensure understanding. Tone mattered deeply. Clarity mattered more than creativity. Language adapted to scale. These shared speeches reinforced collective memory. They reminded people who they were, what they valued, what they had experienced together. Language strengthened unity. As unity strengthened, shared identity emerged. People described themselves not only as individuals or families, but as part of a larger whole. Language named that belonging. Once belonging was named, it could be protected. Language defined boundaries, who was included, who was not. These distinctions were not always harsh, but they were meaningful. Language shaped social structure. As structure developed, roles became clearer. Certain people spoke on behalf of others. Certain voices carried authority. Language shaped leadership. Leadership relied heavily on language. Commands alone were not enough. Leaders needed to persuade, explain, and reassure. Language became a tool of guidance rather than force. As guidance spread, shared rules emerged. Rules were spoken first, then repeated. Then remembered. Language created order. Order depended on shared interpretation. When people understood words similarly, cooperation flowed smoothly. Misunderstanding weakened trust. Language precision mattered. As precision grew important, definitions emerged. People clarified what words meant. They distinguished between similar ideas. Language sharpened. This sharpening allowed fairness. When words were clear, expectations were clear. Language supported balance. As balance stabilized communities, long-term planning became possible. People spoke about futures far beyond immediate needs. Language allowed vision. Vision shaped action. Groups worked toward shared goals. Language coordinated effort across time. As time horizons expanded, humans developed deeper historical awareness. They spoke about past generations not as distant figures, but as part of an ongoing story. Language preserved continuity. Continuity influenced responsibility. People acted with awareness of those who came before and those who would come after. Language connected generations. As connection deepened, education evolved again. Teaching was no longer only about skills or survival. It was about understanding. Language taught perspective. Perspective allowed comparison. People compared their ways of life to others. Language facilitated reflection. Reflection sometimes led to change. New practices were discussed. Old ones questioned. Language enabled evolution. As societies interacted, language played a crucial role. Different speech patterns met, different meanings collided. Language became a bridge. Translation emerged as a skill. Understanding another group required patience, listening, and empathy. Language encouraged openness. Through translation, humans recognized shared ideas beneath different sounds. Common experiences found expression in varied forms. Language revealed shared humanity. As this realization spread, curiosity grew. People listened to unfamiliar speech not only to understand but to learn. Language invited exploration. Exploration expanded knowledge. New environments, tools, and practices introduced new concepts. Language adapted to describe them. As language adapted, it grew richer and more flexible. New words entered use. Old words shifted meaning. Language evolved continuously. As complexity increased, humans began reflecting consciously on language. They noticed differences in pronunciation. They commented on expression. Language became an object of awareness. This awareness led to refinement. Speech was adjusted. Clarity improved. Language self-corrected. As correction spread, mutual understanding deepened. Communication became smoother. Language strengthened connection. As connection strengthened, collective decision-making improved. Groups discussed options. They weighed outcomes. Language supported consensus. Consensus enabled stability. Stability allowed creativity. Language supported growth without chaos. As creativity expanded, expression diversified. Songs, chants, and rhythmic speech flourished. Language merged with art. Artful language evoked emotion intentionally. It moved listeners. It inspired reflection. Language touched the inner world. As inner worlds connected through language, empathy deepened. People understood experiences beyond their own. Language expanded compassion. Compassion influenced social behavior. Support became more deliberate. Language guided care. As care increased, social bonds strengthened. Communities grew resilient. Language reinforced belonging. As resilience grew, humans became more comfortable with uncertainty. They spoke openly about unknowns. Language embraced ambiguity. Ambiguity allowed exploration. Not everything needed immediate explanation. Language allowed questions to remain open. As openness spread, philosophical thinking emerged. Humans spoke about existence itself, not in abstract systems, but through story and metaphor. Language explored meaning. Meaning shaped values. Values guided action. Language shaped ethics. Ethics were not enforced through commands alone. They were embedded in narratives. Language guided behavior through example. As narratives accumulated, they formed collective wisdom. This wisdom was shared freely. Language preserved it. As preservation improved, humans recognized the power of words. Words could heal. Words could harm. Language demanded care. Careful speech became valued. Listening gained importance. Language emphasized mutual respect. As respect grew, dialogue improved. Differences were discussed rather than avoided. Language supported coexistence. As coexistence stabilized, societies flourished. Language was the unseen foundation. Yet even now, beneath all this complexity, language remained grounded in its origins: breath, sound, connection. The hum of early voices still echoed within every word. As we come to the end of this part, language has become the shared lens through which humanity sees itself and the world. It organizes knowledge, it shapes society, it connects generations, it gives meaning to experience. From the very beginning, language was never just about words, it was about connection. It began as breath in the dark, as instinctive sound shaped by emotion, as humming near firelight. And slowly, so slowly, it became the vessel of everything human. Now at the far end of this story, we can finally look back and see the full arc. Language started as reaction, a warning, a comfort, a call. It did not explain, it did not analyze, it simply responded. But over time, response became recognition. Humans learned that sound could stand for experience, that a voice could carry memory, that meaning could live beyond the moment. Language discovered itself. As sounds became shared, humans became shared. Groups formed not only through blood or proximity, but through understanding. To speak alike was to belong alike. Language drew invisible lines of trust, cooperation, and identity. It allowed humans to move together, to hunt together, to rest together, to remember together. Language made survival collective. Then language did something extraordinary. It learned how to remember the past. Stories formed not as entertainment, but as survival. Each retelling preserved hard-won knowledge. Each repetition carried lessons forward. Each voice added weight to memory. Language became time. The past could speak, the present could listen, the future could prepare. With time came meaning. Humans began asking not only what happened, but why, not only how to act, but how to live. Language slowed itself to hold these questions. Through metaphor, ritual, and story, humans shaped explanations for a world too large to fully understand. These explanations did not need to be perfect, they needed to be shared. Language did not remove mystery, it made mystery bearable. As belief emerged, so did identity. People understood who they were by the stories they told, where they came from, what they valued. Language preserved belonging. It reminded people that they were not alone in the vastness of time. Then language took another quiet step forward. It learned how to leave the body. Marks appeared, symbols followed. Meaning no longer vanished when the voice stopped. Language stayed. It waited on stone, wood, and memory. It crossed generations without distortion. It allowed ancestors to speak to the unborn. This was not just preservation, it was transformation. With permanence came responsibility. Words mattered more when they endured. Speech became careful. Meaning became precise. Language refined itself under the weight of memory. As refinement grew, so did knowledge. Skills were preserved. Wisdom accumulated. Learning became intentional. Language taught humans not only how to survive, but how to understand. Understanding reshaped thought. Humans learned to compare ideas, to reason, to imagine futures before acting. Language became the architecture of the mind. Thought itself began to move in words. As minds aligned through shared language, societies grew. Large groups cooperated, roles emerged, leadership formed, not through force alone, but through speech. Language guided behavior more effectively than instinct ever could. With guidance came ethics, not rules written in stone, but values carried in story. What was honored, what was avoided, what was remembered. Language shaped conscience. As conscience developed, empathy deepened. Humans learned to feel through one another's stories, to understand experiences they had never lived. Language dissolved isolation. Across generations, across landscapes, across time, language adapted. It changed sounds. Shifted meanings, borrowed freely. Yet beneath every variation, the same foundation remained. Breath, sound, connection. Every language, no matter how complex, still carries the echo of those first human hums in the dark. And now here we are. Language surrounds us completely. It shapes how we think, how we feel, how we remember, how we imagine. It is so present that we often forget it had a beginning. But it did, and that beginning was quiet. Language did not arrive with power. It arrived with vulnerability, a need to warn, a need to comfort, a need to belong. Everything that followed, story, wisdom, knowledge, culture, grew from that need. When you speak, you are not just using words. You are continuing a process tens of thousands of years old. Every sentence carries human history within it. Every phrase echoes countless voices before you. Language is not owned, it is inherited. And as this documentary comes to an end, that inheritance continues with you. Every time you listen, every time you speak, every time you remember, language lives on. Thank you for spending this time with us, drifting through the entire history of human languages from grunts to words. If you enjoyed this journey, make sure to subscribe to the channel for more calm, sleep-friendly history like this. Let us know in the comments what part of this story stayed with you the most, and tell us, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Until next time. Rest well, sleep deeply, and let the ancient voices fade gently into silence.